Excellent, perfect. I can see the PowerPoint. So at this time, I would like to introduce Greg Core, the Director of Monitoring and State Improvement Planning with OSEP. Greg?
Thank you, Jennifer, and welcome to all of you on the call. The topic that we'll be exploring today is SSIPs, SSIPs. Hope you see on your screen the title slide, Let's Talk SSIPs, and that's what we'll be doing today. The purpose of the call is to discuss the upcoming Phase 3, Year 4, if you can believe that, SSIP reporting requirements, our focus for reviews, and how to communicate any significant changes that have occurred or that the state intends to make in the upcoming months. But before we get to that, just a few announcements. So this is the last regularly scheduled TA call for not only the year, but the decade as we head to 2020. However, we do have a special TA call scheduled for this following Monday, the 16th. I want to make sure that everybody is aware of that. We wanted to make sure to have this call before January. So this call will be focusing on the next SPP APR submission for FY 2018. During the call, we will preview the new APR reporting tool. As we've said a number of times before, we will be transitioning from grads to our new reporting tool, which should be open to states in January. So we'll be talking about how you log in, how you navigate in the new tool. In addition, on the same call, we're going to provide guidance on reporting on pre-finding correction and correction of non-compliance. You should have gotten a message, I believe went out yesterday. If not, you can send me an email and I'll make sure that you get the message, which gives you the registration information for that call. But again, it's this Monday at 4 o'clock, December 16th. One more announcement before we get started talking about SSIPs. If you've read the most recent copy, the November copy of the OSEP update, the external Grad 360 website, which we have known and loved, maybe cursed at a little bit occasionally, but that we've been using for the past however many years, will no longer be available for submission of your SPP APR, but it will stay active until the fourth quarter of 2020, which is a little better than what we had originally thought. We thought that it would be sunsetting very quickly after we transitioned to the new platform, but that's not the case. We know there's a tremendous amount of information on there. We hope to migrate that to the new website and other locations during 2020. But in the meantime, it will stay open, so you can go back, click on your state, look at your SPP, APR reviews, other information connected to last year and previous years' SPP APRs. What does this mean for the public? That means all of the publicly available information currently housed on grads will remain on grads, at least through that fourth quarter, or until, I believe it's until the fourth quarter of 2020. What does this mean for state users? The SPP APR online submission system, currently hosted by Grad 360, as you know, has retired. Beginning with this next SPP APR submission due on February 3rd, 2020, going to have to get used to that date, 2020, states will submit using the department's universal APR tool currently under development on the EdFacts metadata process system. That's a mouthful. We will provide a demo during that special call on the 16th. As with all of our national TA calls, both today's call on the SSIPs and Monday's call on the new reporting tool will be recorded and posted on the Grad 360 website. So you can go back and listen to that again or urge other people who haven't been on the call to listen to it. Contact your state lead if you have any questions. Also, I sent out a message earlier this week that the FFY 2017 data displays are now live on Grad 360, where the public can go find the APRs, and you look under the Research tab and then under Final SPP APRs. The teams work very hard to prepare them, and they are full of information which you and your public will find useful as well. That is the end of my announcements then. So I'm here today with Leslie Fox, who is the facilitator for our Performance Accountability Information Team and all things OSEP, and she is going to walk us through the upcoming Phase 3 Year 4 submission. Leslie?
Thank you, Greg, and happy December to all of the callers on the phone. I do want to give a quick little shout out that Jennifer Reed, who introduced this call, is monitoring the chat box or the questions box. So as I'm speaking, if there's something you'd like her to ask, she will monitor those questions, interject throughout the presentation, or at the end, just bring up the questions that have been sent in. So please go ahead and use that feature. And also she has converted the slides to a PDF, and you can find those in the handout section if you've logged into the GoToWebinar. So if you want immediate access to the slide information, that's a PDF in the handout. But as Greg mentioned, this call and the slides will be posted to Grad 360 in the upcoming weeks. So you'll be able to access them at that time as well. So thank you for making time for today's call. We've done this call or something similar to it for the last couple of years, and I think in general we have found states to really appreciate the opportunity before they get into the thick of SPP APR submission due in February and all the things that come with the new year, to just get a sense from OSEP and some clarity on exactly what the reporting requirements are for the OSEP. So that's indicator B17 or C11. And really what OSEP is looking for in terms of our reviews, so that they can make sure that states submit not only the required information, but the kind of information that we look at and think about when we're planning our technical assistance and engagement activities throughout the year. So that's what I hope to cover today. If something is unclear, as always, please send a question to Jennifer or reach out to your OSEP state lead. You can contact me as well, but it's just best to go to your OSEP state lead. And we can always set up a one-to-one conversation to talk about really state-specific questions or issues that you might want to address a little more thoughtfully than we could cover in a national TA call. But that said, a number of,
There we go.
I was about to say, I'd like to start with the fundamentals, because we know that there can often be a lot of turnover at the state level, or in terms of people who are responsible for facilitating and driving and reporting out on the state systemic improvement plan activities within the state system. So these are just some fundamentals to keep in mind. For the OSEP that's due in April 1st of 2020, this is a required indicator in the APR, but the measurement language has not changed. And it's the same reporting requirement as it has been for the last 2 years under this current measurement language. We're really looking for a report out on the activities that were implemented as a result of your improvement plan, the evidence-based practices that are being implemented or supported by the state at the LEA level intended to impact the state-identified measurable result, or the SIMR, and any supporting data, including the required FFY data for the indicator. So this is not new. And when I walk you through some of this, I'm going to tie it back to the measurement language, because I just like to kind of ground the state personnel in this is what OSEP is held to in terms of what we review for, and to make sure that we are consistently looking at information across all of the submissions, B and C, and that we are approaching our feedback to states from a consistent point of view. So the reporting requirement is unchanged thus far. States must, no later than April 1st, submit both your FFY 18 data and a substantive report. And really the purpose of today's call is to talk about what do we mean by substantive. But a substantive report that's describing the implementation and the evaluation of the state-identified critical activities. You need to Also, consistent with the other indicators in this particular package, identify a reported target for FFY19 because the current package has been extended a year and you'll need to do that for all the indicators. But you will definitely need a similar target for FFY19 to also be included in this submission. There is not a required reporting format for the OSEP. And I think the reason we've held true to that is because we do view this as the state's plan. We recognize that how the state chooses to organize and communicate the key activities it's implementing and evaluating that are intended to be meaningful for system change and ultimately impact infant, toddler, student, or family outcomes. You answer to many gods within your own system. A lot of times there's information there that your own stakeholders would like you to include, or there's a format that is preferred within your system. So we try to be very respectful of that, which is why there's not a required reporting format for the narrative that you are submitting along with your FFY data. That said, we have also gotten feedback from states that you do like to have a little guidance and shaping. Recognizing that this is not a dissertation and it shouldn't be an overt writing burden. So there are a couple of optional templates that are out there. One of them was developed by one of our OSEP-funded TA centers a couple of years ago. I think maybe half the states use that template to report out the work that they put into place this past year and want to communicate to OSEP. And this can be found on Grad 360, and I have a slide later on that shows you exactly where. This past year, due to other questions we were getting from a number of states about exactly what they needed to communicate in terms of bare minimum and as efficiently as possible, we have another optional template or format that you may follow, and it can be found on the collaboration space of the Ideas That Work page under the Part C tab, State Systemic Improvement Plan. But these are optional and really just give you an idea, if you even look at them, of consistently, year to year, this is what we're looking for. A report out on the work that took place, what is different about your system as a matter of this work, how you know it's important, and what does it mean for child, student, family, infant, toddler outcomes. There's no maximum or minimum requirement for the OSEP, but as I said, in the past couple of years, my colleagues on the Performance Accountability team, Janine Rutter and Kathy Heck, have pulled together great presentations that have laid out examples of how states are thoughtfully communicating the required information, but also doing it in a very succinct and clear manner. And those TA calls can be found, once again, on Grads in our TA tab. I have a slide later on where you can see what that looks like as well. But I really encourage you, especially if you're new to this work, to go back and revisit those previous presentations because they give real specific state examples, and it holds true because, once again, the reporting requirements have not changed. But we also get a lot of questions about the reporting period. So the FFY data is for the SPP APR period. So FFY 18 data is what you need for your simmer. The activities you need to report on at a minimum should cover that July 1st, 2018 through June 30th, 2019 timeframe. But this is considered to be a real-time indicator around the actual report and the activities that are implemented. Because when you think back to phase one, that was based on, you reported out on 2 years worth of work that communicated, this is what we want to do, this is our focus area. Based on that analysis, you developed a plan that was submitted the following year. Based on that plan, you started to implement work. And so the work that has been implemented is actually much more of a real-time indicator than what would be reflected in the FFY data, which is 18 months in arrears. So we do encourage states. What that basically means is, come April, feel free to include information that goes through March if you want, but December 2019, August of 2019, really the most up-to-date information you can provide is the most meaningful. But at a minimum, you must include information that goes through June 30th of 2019. So, straight from the measurement language, really, this is what you have to include in your OSEP report. You want to include your current theory of action. And the reason we say that is because many states, and this is not a negative thing, have revised their theory of action based on the work that they've implemented. They tried out some strategies. The original theory of action was grounded in certain assumptions that were made based on their system analysis. As they started to implement activities, they realized that some of those assumptions didn't necessarily hold as true, or some were not as important as they originally thought they were going to be. So they've revised the theory of action to really reflect this is the critical work that needs to take place in the order and sequence in which it needs to happen. And a lot of times states elaborate on that in a logic model or some other performance plan, implementation plan that lays out a little more detail of exactly what activities and outcomes are to take place. But a logic model and that kind of level of detail isn't required, but the theory of action is. You will provide an update on your infrastructure improvement activities or coherent improvement strategies, whichever term you're using. You will report out on the implementation status of the evidence-based practices you intended to support and how they're being implemented with fidelity. Stakeholder engagement is critical at all aspects of this work, in all aspects of our work, really. But it's something we look at very thoughtfully when we review the OSEP report. And you will report on progress toward the simmer. So you will provide your FFY simmer data and indicate whether or not you met your target or didn't and why. And then we really do encourage states to include any additional data that would indicate or support that they are making progress toward their simmer above and beyond that simmer data. Once again, the simmer data is 18 months in arrears. And there could be other data that is indicative of the importance of this work and how it's impacting students, children, and infants, toddlers, and families that you may want to communicate that say, given more time, we would see this playing out in our statewide data as well. There's a requirement in the measurement language around discussing scale up, and there is language around sustainability planning and consideration. And then once again, really any barriers or your TA needs that you anticipate. So I'm going to elaborate on each of these, hopefully not being pedantic for the next few minutes, but I'm going to pause to see, Jennifer, are you getting any questions from the listeners?
Actually, the only questions that we've had come in so far were questions related to the call on Monday. So we are good there.
Okay.
Well, that is very helpful because I have no information about the call on Monday. Okay, so this is straight from the measurement language. When you look at your instructions for the SPP APR, each indicator has, of course, required measurement language. And this is what you see for B17, C11. This is verbatim. Section B, paragraph 1, under the measurement language. You are reporting out and need to include a summary or a synthesis, depending on how you like to approach things, of the work that's been implemented. This should align with your theory of action. And really the theory of action, of course, should reflect your system analysis and the plans that have been previously submitted. But this alignment piece is really critical. It can be very tempting to describe all the work that has gone on in the state throughout the year. And we don't want to minimize the importance of that work. But if you are reporting out on a lot of activity around increasing graduation rates or engaging families about post-school outcomes, that's really, really important. But it's hard to understand how that's supporting your simmer focus, which is third grade literacy. So, I'm not really kind of being joking, but we do have a lot of states that provide a whole lot of information around a lot of work that's going on in the state. But really what we're looking for is some streamlined information about relative to our system analysis and the infrastructure that we want to improve, that we intend to use to leverage and support the use of evidence-based practices intended to impact our simmer focus area. This is the work that took place, because that's the indicator. And so really we do look for alignment of the work with the theory of action. And many of you who've been around in the past few years have heard me joke. I print these out. I tape the theory of action to the wall in front of me. I read your ESSEPs, and when I read things, I just immediately look up to see where does this fall in the theory of action? How does this fit in? Is this the if statement? Is this a middle then statement? Is this the long-term outcome? And really, I try to make that connection, but the point of the narrative is for you to make that connection. And our TA centers who do draft reviews are really, really great at communicating to you whether or not some of the connections you're making are clearly related, or if there are some logic jumps that the reader's being asked to make. And it's those kind of gaps that you want to be able to bridge. So, infrastructure. Straight from the measurement language, section B, paragraph 2. You want to summarize your infrastructure improvement activities. Relate them to outcomes that you had identified as important, and discuss really how you've engaged your stakeholders to agree upon whether or not you've met certain successes, whether those outcomes have been met, whether you want to continue the strategy even though you haven't met the outcomes because you think there's data to support that it's helpful, whether you've hit some barriers or some roadblocks and you've engaged your stakeholders to address those. But really, all of this is intended to communicate what's different about your system as a result of this work that began five and a half years ago. And I'd like to hone in on that because there are two critical elements to the actual narrative report. There's the part around the infrastructure, which is your system work. And then there's the part about the evidence-based practices, which are really intended to impact the actual SIMR data. But the system work is really important. And I think sometimes states, when I've noticed the past, 4 years of reading ethics, all of them, is that states often lean more toward one than the other. They report out a lot on the infrastructure work that's under play or in play, but there's not a lot of information around the actual practices that are being implemented and how they know they're being implemented with fidelity, or how they know that they're leading to changes for infants, toddlers, or students. Or they report out on the evidence-based practices and we're like, yes, but what about your system? Because the point of the indicator is really the state is thoughtfully and intentionally try to improve its system with the idea that that will then allow them to better improve instructional or intervention practices. So you really want to be able to, if you identify 7 infrastructure or coherent improvement strategies, some years you may not have a lot of movement on all 7, but it really is helpful if you say, okay, we had 7 strategies for this reporting period. We had a lot of focus on strategies 1, 3, 5, and 6. The others continued out without any significant changes, or we had to postpone work on evidence on strategy number 7, whatever the circumstances are. But really what we do and often do is say, okay, you had identified 7 strategies and you're reporting on 1. What happened to the other 6? Are they no longer important? Did you meet all those outcomes in previous years and really now there are no big changes? I think that's just really important information to be able to, once again, very succinctly communicate the status of your specific strategy each year, even if the status is really nothing's changed this year or we've had a speed bump in the process. As we get more into OSEP reports, changes are made. You can't necessarily go back to the phase 1 or phase 2 plan and assume that those strategies that were first identified are the ones being implemented. So there just needs to be a certain amount of continuity of information year to year. We have changes in our staff, just like you have changes in your staff. It's hard to pick one of these up at year 4 in the implementation process and figure out what's going on unless you communicate that. And that's probably the same at your end. If you've had changes at your state level or some of your local program level, I seriously doubt any of your LEA directors or early intervention program directors are going back and rereading the phase 1, phase 2, and years 1 through 3 submissions. So what's the critical information that brings them up to speed, and what's the progress on the strategy? Greg.
Can I ask a question? Leslie had given me permission to ask questions earlier. So would you expect that at this point, we're in phase 3, year 4, is that right? That there would be more emphasis on implementation of evidence-based practices than on infrastructure, changes to the state's infrastructure?
I think that's a great question. I'll give you my opinion.
All right.
My opinion is no. I think there continues to be strong focus on both. They both carry weight. I think we've learned as a result of this work how slow actual infrastructure and system change can take. I think many states tackled this work as it was intended with really ambitious goals and huge system ideas, and then feasibility and resources became real issues that needed to be tackled, so they had to scale down and focus on certain aspects of the infrastructure, but those other needs are still there. But there is a fundamental piece of you cannot spend 5 years focusing only on your infrastructure and not have anything that's being implemented or supported that actually would impact your simmer data. And that's usually considered the intervention practices or the frameworks that are being used in states to support the use of effective practices. I think about MTSS in Part B and RBI in Part C as sort of frameworks that foster the use of practices within them. But the evidence-based practices piece is non-negotiable. We don't get to ignore what's going on with children and families and students and youth while we work on our infrastructure.
Well, that's the bottom line for the OSEP, right?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
But
Thank you. That's helpful.
Absolutely. Jennifer, are there any other questions from the group?
No additional questions at this time.
Okay. Then what does OSEP look for? So for those of you who were able to participate in the session Greg, Alicia Walters, and I led at our OSEP Leadership Conference this past summer, we talked about how when we do our reviews, we like to be able to select the statement that best fits what we read. This is sort of our way of saying, okay, the state included the required information for the measurement language. We get a sense that they're staying on course, even though sometimes the path may weave a bit. Or they reported really most of the information, but maybe there was some information that was either unclear or the connections to the long-term work were not as clearly communicated, or the reader was sort of left, the reviewer was left with thinking, okay, I'm not exactly sure what happened to this strategy or that outcome, or where they're going to go next with this, because they had identified short-term outcomes but really hadn't yet thought about, well, then what would be the next step for some of these strategies? What would be an intermediate outcome or a long-term outcome that we're now moving toward? Or frankly, the state didn't include the required information. So we had 4 of these statements last year, and now we've condensed them down to 3 just to make it a little tidier, because we know how everybody loves tertiles. Sorry. But really, if you look at these statements, when our OSEP state leads do their primary review, and that's what we anticipate come April, the OSEP state lead will do the first pass review. And then we will have others that do secondary and possibly third-tier reviews, depending on our internal capacity, depending on need. But we will always have 2 reviewers. And the first statement, the A statement, is really the measurement language. You reported progress for your assets on each improvement strategy or strand in your theory of action, depending on how you organize that, and you communicated how that is intended to impact the simmer. Some things are, once again, to foster and build up your system capacity, and some are more directly related to instructional practices. But your infrastructure component, that's what we look for. If section B, sentence B is selected, then we get a sense of what took place. We get a sense that you implemented a lot of the work that you intended to do, but maybe it's unclear, kind of really that so what question. So you had 15 different professional development activities, or you had 5 focus groups, but you're not necessarily explaining, well, what was the point of those, or what was the outcome, or how do you know that they were effective or led to any intended outcome? So it's kind of that so what question. And then really, of course, the third one is the information wasn't there, or something was there, but it was really hard to understand the impact of this on, or intended impact of this for the state system or the simmer. I think this is a really important point that I want to emphasize to our grantees. Infrastructure improvements and evidence-based practices are intended to lead to some kind of significant change in a child or student level outcome. The data you report for the simmer is supposed to be reflective of this work. So just because you report your simmer data, there's nothing that's going on in your OSEP report that says, well, anything we were doing was actually leading to that data. That's questionable, because the SIMR data should reflect this work. And for the first couple of years, I think we all acknowledge that because the SIMR data is 18 months in arrears, and the infrastructure and evidence-based practices are being implemented in real time, that you wouldn't expect something that took place in calendar year 2017 to impact FFY15 data. But we're now reaching a point where there's been enough time of implementation where we might expect some of that work to start to be reflected in the SIMR data. So it's really important to make those connections, because otherwise you're already reporting SIMR data for the most part in another indicator. We're interested in how the work that's taking place is impacting or will eventually impact that SIMR focus. Evidence-based practices, which is a former interventionist term, more my favorite. So really, measurement language, section B, paragraph 3, the specific evidence-based practices. We have historically been very open to what the state considers evidence-based practices. Some states, as I said, are focusing on frameworks like MTSS or routine-based intervention, RBI. Others have identified very specific practices like a literacy program or graduation or dropout prevention program, or specific strategies that early interventionists are expected to implement as part of the RBI model around family-focused assessment or improving child outcomes data summary process, which is really a nice hybrid of formative and summative assessment intended to impact actual intervention planning. So what you really want to be able to do is just describe the practices and the activities that were implemented to support their use. And make the connection about how these practices, especially if you're focusing on a framework, are intended to impact the SIMR. So what's the point of impact? Is it the evidence-based practices intended to impact your district policies or procedures? Is it something very specific around teacher or provider practices? And particularly in Part C, is it a focus around parent or caregiver outcomes? Or is it something intended to directly impact child-student performance? And so you should be able to communicate what the evidence-based practices are that are being supported in the state and how you're supporting them, the point of impact, and then really how do you know that they're being implemented as intended? How do you know that they're actually being implemented with fidelity? And what data are you collecting around that would support that statement? So that's really the key piece of the measurement language. And once again, this is not new. And states were asked to identify their evidence-based practices in the submission that was due under phase 2. So that would have been in 2016. So it's not unheard of that we're asking you about your evidence-based practices 5 years later. So describe the data, communicate it. And once again, this is just a little graph to show we recognize that some practices could have multiple points of impact, but really a lot of times they start with a focal point and then may have subsequent impact. So if something's impacted your program, then eventually it may lead to changes in provider behaviors. The things that come to mind are MTSS. If you're bolstering your multi-tiered system of support program, process, framework within your state, that's more at the program level. Within that, there are specific practices or strategies you want your teachers or providers to utilize. At some point, those strategies are intended to be done well enough and frequently enough that they actually improve or impact a child-level outcome. So you don't necessarily have to report all of that data, but if you're talking about something that impacts your program, then we are going to ask you at some point, what does this mean for your actual provider practices? What does this mean for students or families, in particular, if you're talking about some of the work you're doing in Part C? So really, it's important that you understand the point of impact for your practices and that you communicate that. But when we have more thoughtful conversations during feedback calls or when we do on-site technical assistance visits, we often will go deeper into okay, what's the next step? What additional data are your programs collecting? How do you know that this is leading to the actual student or child level outcome you intended to? Fidelity, this is just some look-fors we look for when we're talking about, when we're talking about fidelity. We look to see, have you identified a tool or a specific process that allows you to observe and document the implementation of the evidence-based practices? And by you, I mean people within your state. Clearly, at the state office, you are not going into classrooms and doing observations. But is there a process in place? If coaching is what you're trying to facilitate at the state level, that you will have coaches that work with teachers and providers and families. What's the process for know that your coaching is being done effectively? What's the process or tool that's being utilized to know that what you're coaching around is actually being implemented with fidelity? And so these are just really important things to keep in mind. We look to see, do you collect and use the fidelity data to inform whether or not you should continue the practice, whether or not you should continue supporting the practice, how it might impact scale up, is it sustainable? These are sort of conversations we like to have, but once again, they are tied to the measurement language. And then these are the three statements. Really, for the reporting period, evidence-based practices were implemented and fidelity data collected and used for decision making. You can communicate that, you're golden as far as the measurement language is concerned. A lot of times what we're still hearing, or last year, I should say, a lot of times last year, a number of states are still struggling with the fidelity piece. I know we've had a lot of questions regarding technical assistance and support about fidelity data tools and collection procedures and processes. I really encourage you to reach out to our OSEP funded TA centers because they're really good at this and can help you troubleshoot the specific issues that may be going on in your state. But once again, if you contact your OSEP state lead, alert us to the issue, we will also communicate to our OSEP funded TA centers that this is something that we're getting a lot of questions or issues around. And then, of course, if there are not any evidence-based practices or the practices have been identified, but states are really just at the point where we're doing webinars, we're holding PD sessions, but that's not really, they're being implemented, that's not looking at fidelity. That's you're disseminating information and building up knowledge around it. But at this point, we're really interested in knowledge use. This is a great slide my colleague Janine Rutter developed. I cannot take credit for anything that looks clever, but I think it's really, it bridges the two right and left hands of the indicator, that infrastructure and systems level work is really intended to help foster and promote effective instruction and intervention. It's not one or the other. And although there can be some great things going on at the classroom or program level or home level, without the infrastructure, it is very difficult to sustain that work. And it's certainly difficult to leverage it to other child outcomes above and beyond the SIMR focus. Any questions, Jennifer?
We did have one question that came in stating that they are newer to the SSIP process, and they were wondering why the SIMR data is 18 months in arrears.
Because it's the SPP APR data, and all of it is 18 months in arrears. It's reported out for the federal fiscal year. But you can provide more real-time data. And I think that's actually something I look for, and we're about to talk about that. You know, if the SIMR data is the required data, and for most, it's their statewide data for the indicator area, so graduation, dropout, assessment data for reading or math, and then for Part C, one of the 3 child outcome areas. So it's data they're reporting in another aspect of the SPP APR. But some states are looking at pilot programs, transformation zones, specific ESSEP districts, and so they often have additional data, or their SIMR data is more real-time because they're collecting it as a result of this work and they're analyzing it differently. But I think it is really important if you have more up-to-date information or additional progress monitoring or supporting information, to report that as well. I think it's helpful for your own stakeholders. I think it keeps your own, your providers and your other administrators within your system engaged in the work and recognizing that it's meaningful. And I think it really helps with the decision-making component. Greg?
One of the big differences between this indicator and all the others is that, you know, the submission is not until April instead of February. So that does provide a little extra time. So even though it's going beyond the technical reporting year, you can collect data that might give you an indication that, yeah, we're on track, we want to continue, or perhaps we'll make some modifications in our approaches.
Yes, which leads directly into progress actually implementing your ethics. Ultimately, I try to keep it really simple. To quote my colleague Curtis Kennard on the Performance Accountability Team, it just, straightforward and keep it simple. There's a lot to be said for that. Is the state doing what it said it would do? If I bump into Greg in the elevator and he asked me about state X, I would be able to say, you know what, I just finished their ESSA. Sounds like they're implementing what they said they were going to do. I have a sense of these outcomes were achieved. These are some of the speed bumps they had. This is what they plan to do about it. And I really got a strong sense about why this matters for their system and ultimately why this may matter for children and youth in their programs. If I can answer that question in that 5-minute elevator speech, once again, then the state has effectively communicated what it needed to. If I can't, it doesn't mean the work is not taking place. It just means we're going to have a different conversation when it comes time for ESSA feedback calls, either to ask the state to elaborate or provide some supplemental information over the phone. If we go on site, a lot of times it's to provide some documentation, or we go to programs and have conversations with the actual providers and districts. So infrastructure improvements, there are different ways you can capture these. Really, you can just report out on your activities. If you have a logic model or really a project management or implementation plan, as long as it's really clear, this is what was implemented during the reporting period, this is the data that was collected, and this is the next step, then you're good. If you want to list it out in more of a narrative around milestones, as long as it's very clear what's considered a milestone and why, or that you're comparing this to a different point in time in the work, that's something a lot of states choose to report out in comparison in terms of the narrative. Several of our centers, CSIP, ECTA, NCSI, have different tools and resources they have developed to work with states to help them capture and define and describe and measure infrastructure improvements and progress toward infrastructure goals. So I just really encourage you to reach out to your TA providers, reach out to your OSEP state lead if one of these sounds of particular interest, and we'll connect you with the appropriate TA center that could help provide those support. So stakeholder engagement, I'm not going to belabor this other than to say it's really important, and we are very interested in engagement with stakeholders, not just dissemination of information. And I think by now, many of you have gotten a sense of what it's like to, the higher you get on the ladder, the more it sways. So if, so if you have not effectively and routinely engaged your stakeholders in this work, both to solicit input, to help make decisions, to explain with them and to them the data that's being collected in a way that's meaningful, then what tends to happen is that either they lose interest and you lose those resources when it comes time for implementation, or you start to sway to the winds of new demands, the new issue of the day. Why do we have to focus on literacy? Our new governor or our new legislature really has an interest in math. So why are we going to persist with this? And strong stakeholder engagement cannot always prevent those kinds of changes, but can certainly be a way to mitigate or buffer some of them because they're committed to different aspects of your system. So we do look to see how states disseminate information about the ESEP, the different communication strategies that are used to engage their stakeholders, and how stakeholder input has been used. And so, once again, the level of detail can vary. One example is often fine in terms of meeting the measurement language. We don't need to know about every activity with stakeholders that took place throughout the year around every strategy, but we do need to leave with a sense that you're actually engaging with your stakeholders around this work. And these are the sentences we look at to see, okay, if I needed to describe the stakeholder engagement aspect of state X, which statement would best capture what I read in the state report? The last one, measurement language requirements. The state must report the SFY data. I cannot emphasize that enough. It is due April 1st along with your report. We do our best as soon as they come in April to identify any states that maybe had inconsistencies in the data they report online with what's in their actual OSEP narrative. If the state failed to communicate information in either the online format or the narrative, we try to flag that as quickly as possible so it can be addressed during clarification. But as Greg mentioned, these come in April 1st, and there are 116 of them. So the responsibility is on the state to make sure that you include your FFY simmer data. And like I said, to date, we have not missed one where a state maybe forgot to include something and couldn't fix it during clarification, but the responsibility is on the state to submit the substantive report and the FFY simmer data. And you need to report out on whether you met your target, just like you do for every other indicator. Any additional data. Now, this is optional. You're not required to provide additional data, but any additional data that you collect and use that would be indicative of progress towards your simmer is very helpful, both for you and your stakeholders, but also for us to also understand that, you know what, that statewide data is not yet having a big shift or not as quickly as the state had anticipated, but there is other data that says the work that is in place is leading to the intended changes around literacy, math, child outcomes of knowledge and skills, ability to meet their needs, social emotional development, graduation, dropout, or any combination of those if states have more than one simmer. So I just think it's really important to communicate if you're collecting that data and using that data, that additional information, qualitative or quantitative, is available that supports the importance of this work and that it's leading to the intended changes. So progress towards the simmer can be measurable improvements in the actual simmer data, yay, additional measures of progress or some kind of intermediate outcome data, or something more formal like actual progress monitoring data. And then we select one of these statements. And in this case, we kept the 4. And I'll just walk you quickly through them. Statement A is sort of the gold standard, but most states don't reach this. At least they haven't so far. I have high hopes for the next submission. But it's hard. It's hard to have meaningful change in statewide simmer data, which is what makes this difficult. But for statement A, the state would have met their simmer target and they're providing additional data. It's kind of twofold there. The second one is the state is providing additional data or interim measures of progress, but they're not yet meeting their simmer target. Once again, this is just to reflect that we know that there can be great improvements taking place that are meaningful that are not yet captured in that statewide data. So this is acknowledging that there's progress being made, but it's just not yet reflected in that statewide data. The next one is you met your simmer target, but you didn't report any other data. That's fine. That's still, once again, acceptable in terms of the measurement language. We can't really argue with you if you met your target, but we will expect in that narrative to understand how the activities that took place were what led to that simmer change, not just that it was luck or happenstance or you had low targets and you had met them the last 3 years anyway, so why would this year be any different? We are looking for an association between the work that's in place and the actual data. And then the last one, of course, would be that did not meet the simmer target or report progress monitoring data. So that would be different ways that states can communicate progress toward the simmer. Modification or changes. We've gotten a number. Oh, wait, Jennifer, any questions?
We did. We had one question that came in. It's 2 parts. It said, are there specific stakeholders OSEP expects to be engaged? And are there different methods OSEP values as engagement?
I think the answer would be no. I don't think we have, like in other words, the measurement language does not lay out required individuals as stakeholders for phase 3. I think best practice, of course, there's a lot of research, and I think our colleagues that do leading by convening and work around stakeholder engagement can give you better guidelines on who different stakeholders would be around different aspects of the work. Parents and families, of course, come to mind. Teachers and providers come to mind, but no, the answer, the bottom line is no in terms of required stakeholders. The second one, I can't say that we value different ways of engaging stakeholders above and beyond others. I think it's like anything else. If the state says that this was meaningful and they communicate why they think it's meaningful, we are not particularly in a position to disagree.
Yeah. So,
Greg, I'm looking at Greg.
only thing, I think that's absolutely right, Leslie. The only thing I would add is that I think Leslie said this earlier, that just getting up in front of your stakeholders and kind of disseminating or describing what you're doing is probably not what we have in mind. We anticipate more kind of an active role of stakeholders, that you not only provide them with information, but also kind of seek their input. We know that in some cases, some of the data is fairly technical, so you might also want to think about how do I effectively communicate technical data to more of a lay audience so that they understand the fundamentals of what you're trying to do and can give you useful feedback on that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, particularly around the data piece, since we do value data so much. Meaningful communication of data, ensuring that they understand what they're being asked to weigh in on is really important. And I know IDC and DAISY come to mind as two of our centers that have done a lot of work on how to develop infographics and how to really communicate data in a meaningful way to different types of stakeholders. But once again, to the question at hand, no, I do not think we're in a position to say weekly meetings are more valuable than quarterly webinars. Like the mode of communication just needs to make sense to us, I guess.
Going back to that leading by convening material, I think that might be really helpful in you considering what some of the options are and then what works best for your state.
Right. Any other questions, Jennifer? I'm going to jump in because I know we only have like 5 minutes left.
Nope, no additional questions at this time.
Great.
Right.
Communicating changes. So that's something that's not as clearly defined in the measurement language. Really, when you look back at other things like the infrastructure language and the evidence-based practice piece, it's predicated on the assumption of a plan, do, study, act mentality. So as you implement your work, you plan something, you implement it, you collect data, you study it, and you make changes along the way that are data informed and stakeholder driven. And so as long as you're communicating, so if you were changing strategies, for example, like your original strategy was we're gonna implement the Leslie Fox curriculum, and we're gonna start out in 10 schools or 10 EI programs. But then as you implement that, you come to find out that, yeah, it's a great curriculum. She clearly knows what she's talking about, but it's really expensive. And you have to use her forms for copyright reasons, and you have to hire her to come do the consulting and teach your providers. And we have such turnover that maybe, just maybe, there could be another curriculum that is also effective and useful, but not going to bring with it all these challenges to our resources. So you revise your strategy based on that. That revisions like that really don't require a lot of elaboration. It's just, this is an update. This is what we did, and it's embedded in the work that we've kind of discussed already around reporting out what took place in that year around infrastructure and around evidence-based practices. What becomes really interesting is states now, as they're sort of wrapping up this particular information collection period and starting to think about what the future could look like, are thinking about substantive shifts to the work. So changing your simmer focus from family outcomes to knowledge and skill acquisition, or changing your focus in Part B from graduation to third grade literacy. And those are pretty substantive shifts that would require really thoughtful communication of the transition. So what we have here are just, I apologize for the slide, I crammed it all into one slide so you'd have it in one place, but really in SFY 18, so in the report that's due this April, report out on the work that took place under the current ESEP of record. And then so that's your simmer data, that's the brief update that you would provide around the strategies or the activities that took place for the ESEP of record that has been part of OSEP's record in the SPP APR for the past few years. You can then signal that you intend to make a change, and if you have the new summer statement, if you have the new baseline and targets, you can go ahead and report those now if you want, but otherwise you can just signal, we intend to make a shift in our strategy or our summer focus. It's a very substantive shift. You will get the first report out on these activities and the work that's underway in the FFY19 report due in 2021. And that sort of helps to transition the information. You need to communicate the data that was used to identify the new summer focus, baseline and targets, how it was analyzed, and of course, how stakeholders were engaged in this work. But I think what's really critical to report here is you do not get a new 1 year to do an analysis and 1 year to develop a plan and then start reporting out on implementation at year 3 point. Any substantive changes that are taking place at this point, we assume are based on work that has been going on in your state, that are driven by data and analysis that have already been conducted, and your stakeholders have already been engaged in this work, and that's why the change is taking place. And we highly encourage you to leverage and communicate how the work that has been implemented thus far, particularly around your system and infrastructure, can be used to as the starting point or will be continued on in the next essay. So I'm going to pause there because I think that may be a big question in case from our listeners.
We did have one question that came in during this. It asked if you could speak a little more to the scaling up and if it refers to EBP's evaluation, infrastructure, or all of the above.
Do you know what? That is a great question, and I will go ahead and say, I think when we talk about scaling up, we are mostly talking about activities that are taking place in transformation zones, pilot regions, subsets of the state system. Some states are already doing things across the state and what would be considered to be at scale. But scaling up is more, when we talk about that, is for those who started with regional programs with the intentions they would use that information to then broaden the scope. The purpose of the indicator has always been to improve your state system, not elements of your system within parts of your program. So if the infrastructure and evidence-based practices are both being implemented at more of a local or smaller level, then the scale-up would be for both. If the infrastructure activities are taking place across the state, but the evidence-based practices are being implemented in regional zones or on programs, then clearly the evidence-based practices would be what was scaled up. But if that doesn't answer the caller's question, please email your state lead and CC me, and we can walk you through the specifics of your report and what might be appropriate to signal for scale up. So really, there are a couple of slides that talk about the resources, where you can find the organizational outline and optional templates on ideas that work, where you can find the national TA calls that have been very helpful for many states over the past couple of years, and where you will find this one once it's posted. And really, any last-minute questions?
As of right now, no additional questions have come in.
So I'm going to say a thank you to the Performance Accountability Implementation Team. We are small but mighty. Like I said, anything polished in these slides was done by my colleagues. We're led by Judy Gregorian here in MSEP. Our standing members are Kathy Hegg, Curtis Kennard, Janine Rudder, and Alicia Walters within MSEP. And then we have ongoing regular representation and engagement with 3 of our RTP project officers, Jennifer Coffey, Julia Martin-Isle, and Perry Williams. They are regular participants in the performance team meetings and are great resources and colleagues. So I just want to give a real great shout out to all the hard work they do throughout the year.
Yeah, thank you, Leslie. I know we're at or slightly over time, so I'm going to close this out. I want to remind everybody about the Monday 4 o'clock call, where we'll give you more information on our new reporting platform. And I want to wish everybody a happy holiday and a great new year, and that we look forward to working with you in 2020 to improve outcomes for children with disabilities and their families. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone. Enjoy your day.